Hilchos Shofar v'Sukkah v'Lulav Perek Shlishi. The laws of Shofar, Sukkah, and the Lulav, chapter 3. Today is the third and final day where we'll be occupied fully on the mitzvah of Shofar. The Rambam today is actually being studied on Simchat Torah. Of course, we didn't record on the holiday. Like yesterday, we pre-recorded. And as I pointed out yesterday, it's fascinating that we're studying the laws of Shofar on Simchat Torah because Rosh Hashanah and Simchat Torah, the beginning of the month of Tishrei, the high holidays, and the end, the culmination, are actually very much interlinked. Whatever we accomplish in the beginning with bitterness and sadness, we accomplish today on Simchat Torah with joy and celebration. And so to learn about Rosh Hashanah and Simchat Torah is an incredible kiss from Hashem, a divine providence to show us that one is very much connected with the other. And today we spend the chapter discussing the essence of the blowing of the shofar. Yesterday we talked about who is obligated, when to blow. Now let's talk about the actual sounds. What are the sounds that have to be blown, and also at which points in the prayer do they have to be blown in the proper way to go about that. So the Rambam says, Halacha Aleph, Kama tkiyos chayav adam lishmoya b'Rosh Hashanah. How many sounds of the shofar, how many blasts is a person obligated to hear on the new year, Rosh Hashanah? Teisha tkiyos. The bottom line, dry biblical obligation, is 9 blasts. How do we know that there has to be 9 blasts? Lefi shenemar trua b'yovel u'b'Rosh Hashanah shalish pa'amim. Because the word trua, blast, shofar blast, can be found if you combine the expressions of the Jubilee year and Rosh Hashanah 3 times. 2 days ago we talked about it. The mitzvah of shofar is mentioned in 2 contexts. In the context of Rosh Hashanah and in the context of the Jubilee year when they would blow shofar on Yom Kippur to free all slaves and return all real estate, as we will learn about in the end of the 7th book of the Rambam. So here you can see the verse about Rosh Hashanah on the top, and on the bottom you have the verse about the Yovel, and there's another verse that I wasn't able to put on the screen just because there wasn't enough space, a third time where it says the word Trua. Trua is highlighted in red, and you have a third time Trua. Trua means a blast. So you have now 3 blasts. The Chol Trua, and we have a rule that every Teruah, which is the short tu sound, Pshuta lefaneha u pshuta la'achareha. There must be a long blast, a plain blast before it, and a plain blast after it. So if you have 3 obligations of short blasts, and each short blast has a long one before and after, that's a total of 9 blasts. And from tradition, from going back to Moses at Sinai, we learn that all the blasts that take place during the 7th month of the Jewish calendar year, according to the Torah, the calendar begins in Nisan, the month of Pesach, and the month of Tishrei is the 7th month. So all shofar blasts that are blown during the 7th month, echad hein, they all follow one rule. Bein b'Rosh Hashanah, bein b'Yom HaKippurim shel Yovel, whether on the new year or whether on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, teishat tkiyos toikin b'chol echad mishneh, and there are 9 blasts that must be blown. Every one of them, tkiya utrua utkiya, a long blast, a short blast, a long blast, tkiya utrua utkiya, a second time, long blast, short blast, long blast, and a third time, tkiya utrua utkiya, a long blast, short blast, followed by a long blast. Now, if you've been in shul this Rosh Hashanah, or any Rosh Hashanah, you know that it's a little bit longer than that. There's a bunch of more blasts that get blown. So how did that happen? Says the Rambam, Trua zu ha'amura b'Torah, this expression of trua, of short blast, that's written in the Torah, nistapik lanu basafik. The Jewish people got in doubt about its proper interpretation. Lefi oirech hashanim v'rev hagolus, due to the length of the years and the multitude of the exiles. We lost the exact tradition about how this short sound was done. And we no longer know how it must be done, and we have 3 potential options of how it must be done. Imhi hayilolo. Is it the sobbing, shemiyalolin hanoshim beinehen be'es shemiyabevin, which women are accustomed to sob when they sob, very, very short staccato blasts, oy ha'anacha, or is it more like a moan or a groan, kederech she'anacha adam pam achar pam, as a person might groan time after time, like a sigh, when his heart is worried about something great. Or a third possibility, perhaps it's both, a groan and a sob. The longer groan, followed by a sob, which actually typically goes that way. When a person is moaning, he might end up going, sobbing, in a longer, short sound. Maybe they're both together, called the teruah, the short blast. Shekach derech hadoyeg, for so is the way of somebody who expresses worry. Misaneach tchila v'achar kach miyalel. First he groans, then he sobs. Lekach anu oisin hakoil. Therefore, we do all the options. And so, if you actually look, you know what? I'll let the Rambam talk about this for a second. Hayilala, halacha gimel, the Rambam just first tells us, Hayilala, the sab, hisha anu kaidin trua. That's what we call a trua today. The word in the Torah is teruah, could be a reference to either one of the three possibilities. What we call teruah today is actually the sob, the short sobbing. The ha'anacha zu achar zu, and the moaning, one after another, hisha anu kaidin nesa shleisha shvarim. We call it three broken parts, shvarim. So now, since there's three possibilities, maybe the teruah in the Torah is the shvarim, the long moans. Maybe the teruah in the Torah is the teruah, the yalala, the short sobs. Maybe the teruah in the Torah is both. We have to do rounds, which will have them all. And remember, before and after every teruah, there's a long blast. Nimtza, it turns out, Seder Atkiyas Kachu, the order of the blowing of the shofar follows this order. And as a matter of fact, that's how we do it today. And you can see this is a picture from the Machzor, where you can see the order. Tiki mevarech, the person makes a blessing. V'toikeya tikiya, and he begins with a long blast. V'achareha shloisha shvarim v'achareha trua, followed by the mix. That's the first option. Perhaps it's the moan and the sob. V'achareha tikiya, and after it a long blast. V'chayzer keseder zeh shalish pa'amim, and you do that order 3 times, because that would be a total of 9 blasts. A long blast, followed by the teruah, which is a mix of the shvarim teruah, followed by the long blast, and you do that 3 times for a total of 9 blasts. But maybe that's the wrong one. Then you have to blow a long blast, followed by just 3 shvarim, 3 short blasts, followed by the long blast, because that might be the teruah. And you do that 3 times, perhaps those are the 9 blasts that we have to hear on Rosh Hashanah. Then we blow a tekiya, teruah tekiya, long blast, staccato blast, and then a long blast again. The chayzer kaseder azeh shalish pamim, doing that 3 times. Nimtza minyan atkiya shleishim. So we end up with actually 30 blasts. Kedei lehisalik min hasafek, all to leave the doubt, because we want to fulfill the biblical obligation. We don't know which way it is, so we got to do all the ways. That's why shofar blowing takes much longer. Says the Rambam, Dalid shir teruah kishtei tkiyos. The length of the teruah, the length of the staccato blast, has to be long enough, as long as both the long blast that follows, that is before it and that follows it. So it's quite long. Shir shleisha shvarim kitruah, and the length of the 3 blasts has to be like the truah, which is also the length of 2 tekiah, 2 long blasts. So, actually I have a shofar here, maybe I'll just blow it here. People may be used to hearing in the synagogue very short shvarim, tu, tu, tu. But it actually has to be a little stretched out. And the Rebbe would actually do a little sound before and after. So it would sound something like this. So a more extended shvarim. So you get the full sound. And the teruah would also be, like a... Each one is pronounced. So now, if you look at the order here, you can see that each line begins with a tekiah and ends with a tekiah. So the Rambam says, what happens in the following scenario? Hareshataka v'heiria. Let's say you did the tekiah, the first long blast, and then the teruah, the short blast. Whether it's the short blast that's the mix, or the 3, or the 2, doesn't matter. V'taka tekiah aruka umashach b'kishtayim barishayna. Then you blew a tekiah, and you wanted to cover both. You see, it is the tekiah, shvarim, tekiah. Anyway, what's following the tekiah is another tekiah. So you decided, you know what? I'm going to do one long blast that'll cover both. We don't say that it's considered to be like 2 long blasts. And then just do a teruah, the next short blast after it, and continue going with your long blast following it. Even if you stretch a tekiah for the whole day. You're a professional trumpet player. I was in Australia. We used to go visit people on Friday for Miftzayim to put on tefillin with them, and in the month of Elul, we used to blow shofar. So there was a guy, he tells me, you know what, I'm a professional trumpet player. I can blow the shofar without stopping. I know how to consistently breathe in and provide more air to keep on blowing the shofar. And he did it for me. I have it on video somewhere. Just for 2 minutes, he went straight for 2 minutes. He could have gone on all day, literally. So even if you go all day, it's only considered 1 tekiah. So long as it's uninterrupted, it's 1 blast. The chayzer, and then you go back to the next line, and you start from the beginning. And you blow the shofar, long blast, short blast, long blast 3 times. Halacha hey, shamat ki achas b'shah achas. If a person hears one long blast at 1 hour in the morning, ushniya b'shah shniya, the second blast, the short blast, he hears an hour later. Afilu shah kol hayom kula, even if he took breaks all day, hareilu mitztarfin b'yotzei yedei chevasei. All the spread out blasts combine and he fulfills his obligation. Provided that you hear all the blasts in their proper order. Not just collectively you got all 30 blasts. You heard them all in order. Tekiya, teruah, tekiya, tekiya, teruah, tekiya, like that. Not that you would hear a teruah first, the shorter blast, and then the 2 long blasts. Or 2 long blasts followed by a short blast. It has to be long, short, then long. What if you had 9 people lined up and they each blew one of the sounds that you're obligated to hear, and you have all 9 blasts being blown at once? You don't even fulfill one of them because you can't hear both. You can't hear more than one sound at a time. But if you did one person, a second person, a third person, one after another, blowing a long, then short, then long blast, yatsa, you are fulfilling your obligation, even if it's with breaks, even if it takes all day. Because we don't care about breaks, we care about the order. You heard shofar in the proper order, you're good. You don't fulfill your obligation until you hear all 9 blasts. And they're all one big mitzvah, therefore they're essential one to the other. You can't say, hey, I heard 1 tekiya, at least I got a 9th of the mitzvah. No, you got 0. You have to go 100% in, or you're 100% out. Now, that's all as it concerns an individual. The community, when they daven together, they also have to hear the blowings of the shofar within the order of their prayer, within the order of the blessings. This is reference to the Musaf prayer, the prayer that we do after we blow the shofar customarily in the middle of the shul. Then we go to daven Musaf. During the Musaf prayer, we have 3 special blessings, which we'll discuss in a minute. Malchuyot, Zichronot, Shofarot, blessing about God's kingship, blessing about God's remembrance, and a blessing about shofar. And after each of those blessings, we blow a series of shofar blasts. Ketzad, what does it look like? The leader of the congregation begins the Amidah with the typical first 3 blessings. Avot is the blessing about our forefathers, Magen Avraham. Gvurot is the blessing about God's strengths. He brings down the rain in its time. Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, he brings the dead to life. He gives the living sustenance, etc. And the blessing about God's holiness, Atakadosh V'Shem Hakadosh, which we end on Rosh Hashanah with Hamelech Hakadosh, the Holy King. Umalchuyos. Then you say the blessing about God's kingship. V'Tekea Shalish, and you blow 3 out of the 9 blasts. V'Yimer Zichrenos V'Tekea Shalish. Then you say the blessing about God's remembrance, and you blow another 3 blasts. V'Yimer Shofres V'Tekea Shalish, and you say the blessing about the shofar, and another 3 blasts. V'Yimer Avodah V'Hidayo Birkas Kohen, and then you conclude the Amidah as you usually do with the blessing of the Avodah, Retzei Hashem Elokeinu, God should have goodwill for our service. Hodaya is the blessing of thanks, Modim Anachnu Lach, and Birkat Kohanim as we always do at the end of Musaf. That's how you hear the shofar on the order, in other words, during the prayer. Halacha ches, shalish brachos hamtzoyes elu. Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim shel Yovel. These 3 blessings that we recite in the middle of Shemona Esrei on Rosh Hashanah, and we, by the way, also recited on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, Shehin Malchias v'Zichrenis v'Shofres, which they are the blessing about kingship, about remembrance, and about the shofar. Ma'akvei zu ezu. They are essential one to the other. You cannot recite one without reciting the other 2. You don't get a third of the mitzvah. Again, you're 100% in or you're 100% out. In every one of the blessings, you must quote 10 biblical verses on the topic of the blessing. And I actually have a machzor here for Rosh Hashanah, where you can actually see this. In the Musaf prayer, there's first the blessing about Malchuyot, about kingship. And what you do is you quote 10 biblical verses. Shleisha psukim min ha-Torah, u'shleisha mi sefer Tehillim, u'shleisha min ha-Neviim. 3 from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, 3 from Tehillim, from Psalms, and 3 from somewhere in the prophets. Be'echad min ha-Torah mashlim b'eh. In the final 10th verse, you go back to the Torah, to the 5 books of Moses, and you conclude the 10 verses with that. V'im hishlim ba'navi yatsa. If you conclude it with a verse from the prophet, that's also okay. Today we do it all from the Torah. So you can see here, in the machzor, it begins with a verse from the Torah, Kakatuv b'Toratecha, Hashem yimloch le'olam ba'ed, God will be king forevermore. Then we say, V'ne'emar, And it says, and there's another verse that has God's name and the word kingship in it, melech. V'ne'emar, and it says, Vayihi v'shurun melech, also a verse. Fascinating. That's actually a verse from the reading of Simchat Torah, the final portion of the Torah, Zot HaBracha. And then we say, Uv'divrei kodshecha katuv le'mor, in your holy writings it is written, which is Psalms, 3 verses about God's kingship. And then, V'al yedei avadecha haneviyim katuv le'mor, and by your prophets, your servants, it says the following, 3 verses with verses from the prophets. And then we conclude, Uv'toratcha katuv le'mor, in your Torah it is written, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, as we will soon discuss. And that's the final verse about Malchuyot. And the same is true in the next blessing. You see for Zichronot and Shofar, it's the same thing. There's 3 verses from the Torah, 3 from Psalms, 3 from the prophets, and then 1 more from the Torah. If you only said 1 verse from the Bible, 1 verse from the writings, 1 verse from the prophets, you fulfill your obligation. Even if you just say, in your Torah it is written, Hashem. And you just quote 1 verse of the Bible, and you stop, nothing else is needed. Ideally it's 10 verses, but in the bottom line, if you only said 1, you're okay. Today we have a version of the Siddur that is universal. Everybody says the same verses, but there are many verses that have expressions of God's kingship, God's remembrance, and the shofar blowing. So which verses do we choose? There were originally rules. We cannot mention verses about God's remembrance, God's kingship, and the shofar if their context is punishment or bad things. An example for remembrance of punishment would be, we say the verse that God remembered that they are just flesh and blood, and so he can destroy them. It's a remembrance in a bad context. Malchuyos, kingship in a bad context would be, I will rule you with poured out wrath. It's a negative connotation. Shofaros, kegoin tiku shofar bagiva. A verse about the shofar, which would have a bad context, would be the verse in Hosea, blow the shofar in Giva, which again is a beginning of a negative prophecy. But we also do not mention verses of remembrance that are written in a singular form, even if they're good context. Remember me, Hashem, with the goodwill of your nation. Remember me, God, for good. In Hebrew, there are 2 ways to say remember. One has the root of pakad, one has the root of zachar. The root of pakad, says the Rambam, is not considered to be a remembrance for this purpose. Like the verse which says, I will surely remember you. The root is pakod, we don't use that verse. But we could mention verses that have a connotation of punishment to be dealt to the idol-worshipping nations. God is king, the nations tremble. Remember God for the children of Edom, the day of Jerusalem. Bad context for the idol-worshipping Gentiles. God will blow a shofar and go into the southern storm winds and punish the evil nations. That's actually one of the verses which we do say today. It has a bad connotation, but bad not for the Jewish people, rather for the idol-worshipping Gentiles. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, says the Rambam. The verse that says, Hear, O Israel, God is our God, God is one. Ata Hareis Aladas, or another verse, you have been shown to know. Fascinatingly, that's actually a verse which we say on Simchat Torah multiple times. Ata Hareis Aladas, and Hakafos. V'yadata hayom v'ashiveisa levavecha. You should know today and take to heart that God is the one God. Kol pasuk me'elu malchus hu inyonei. Each one of these verses has the context. Its topic is God's kingship. Even if there isn't a mention of the word king. And it is to be treated like the verse that says God will be king forever, or God was king among Yeshurun, amongst the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, as I showed you before, we do say the Shema as one of the verses of Malchut, because the context is kingship. The Rebbe once asked, why is it? Bottom line, God has many ways. He could have made a verse that would actually have the word Melech in it, and it would be, a very deep verse. Why do we choose purposely Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which doesn't have the word Melech in it? And the Rebbe said, because in a way it's even deeper. So long as you have a king and his subjects, there's room for discrepancy. There's difference between them. There's room for self-identity. When you say Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, God our God, He is one, the real meaning of God is one is not God is one and not two. Of course there aren't 2 gods. God is one means God is the oneness of everything. He is the core of every single being. He is the bottom line of our identity. It's the truest form of servitude to a king because you fully unite with him. There isn't you and the king. You and the king fuse into one. And that's why the Rambam says, it doesn't have Zecher Malchus. There's no mention of the king. King isn't a foreign object to you. Malchus hu inyanai, the whole topic, the whole soul of the verse is expressing God's truest kingship in its truest sense, in which Hashem becomes completely united in one with His creation. It's a beautiful talk from Rebbe delivered in 1988. Yud, says the Rambam, Haminag HaPashut, the commonly accepted custom b'seder atkiyos shel Rosh Hashanah b'tzibur, when it comes to the order of blowing the shofar of Rosh Hashanah in the community, kachu, it goes like this. Achar shekoydin b'Torah machazirin hasefer limkoymet. After you read the Torah and you put the Torah scroll back, yoshvin kol ha'am, everybody sits down. Only one person arises and makes the blessing. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu l'shmoya kol shofar. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, sanctified us with His commandments and commanded us to listen to the sound of the shofar. V'chol ha'am einin amen. Everybody answers amen. V'chayzeru mevarich she'echiyanu v'chol ha'am einin achrav amen. He makes she'echiyanu blessing, any blessing that you do, for a mitzvah once in a year, once every couple of months, you make a she'echiyanu. Everybody answers amen. And then he blows the 30 blasts, which we spoke about because of the doubt, in order. And then we say Kaddish, and everybody gets up and prays the Musaf service. Very similar to what we do. After the Torah is read, we don't put the Torahs back, we keep the Torahs out. But that's what we do. We make 2 blessings, and then we blow the shofar. As you can see in the Machzor, those are the 30 blasts. Now, we don't sit either, we stand, because the halachically accepted position is to stand during these tekiyot, but technically in the Talmud they are actually called tekiyot miyushav, the sitting tekiyos, because you were allowed to sit during these blasts. And then we get up and we say Musaf. After the leader of the congregation concludes the fourth blessing, which is the blessing of the kingship, as you can see here, there's a little pause and we blow the shofar. Tekei atkiya, shloisha shvarim, tru atkiya, pam echos. You blow a long blast, the 3 short blasts, the teruah, and a tekiya. We actually do all 10. We do all variations of tekiya, teruah, tekiya. But in the Sephardi, the Rambam's version, they just do the first line here, the second line after the second blessing, and the third line after the third blessing. You make the 5th blessing, which is the blessing of remembrance. And after you finish it, you make a long blast, 3 short blasts, and the long blast again. You do a 6th blessing. Shacharis, the blessing about the shofars. After you finish, you blow a long blast, staccato blast, and a long blast again, and you finish the prayer. We actually do it twice. Once during the silent Amidah, and once during the repetition of the Amidah. So we get both. The same person who blows the shofar when they sit, in other words, in the beginning, he should be the one to blow the shofar in the order of the blessings as they pray, when they stand. And you should not speak between the blowing of the shofar that's done sitting and the blowing of the shofar that's done standing. And if you did speak, even though you transgressed, you don't make a new blessing, you just continue going. Yud Beis. Bidin haya, logic would dictate, sheyisku al kol bracha kol bava mehen shalish pamim, that at every blessing you should blow 3 rounds of every one of the stanzas. Kederach shetaku kishen yeshvin, the same way you blew when you were sitting. Elakevon sheyatzu midei safek bat kiyas shemayusha, but because we've already removed the doubt when we blew the shofar blowings, that we were sitting down, ein matrichin ala tzibur lachzer bahen kula and al seder brachas. We don't force the congregation, we don't bother them to go again in order of the blessing. So we just do 1 stanza, 1 line for every blessing. So they should end up hearing the shofar blown in the order of the blessings. Now, as I said, we do bother the community. We do all 3 stanzas each time. That's because that's become the accepted custom. Everything we just said is all for the community. When you're davening in a congregation in a minyan. But if you're an individual, whether you heard it in the order of the blessings or not, whether you sat or stood, you have fulfilled your obligation. There is no prevailing custom about this. Now says the Rambam, Yud Gimel, while within the blowing of the shofar, you have to be 100% in. And while within the blessings, you have to be 100% in, the 2 aren't essential to one another. In other words, if you only have a shofar, and you don't know the machzor by heart, blow the shofar, don't say the blessings. If you only have a machzor and you don't have a shofar, say the blessings and don't blow the shofar. They aren't essential to one another. The Ravid, one of the primary commentators in the Rambam here, argues. He says, no. In Rosh Hashanah, you must have both. If you only have a shofar and no machzor, don't bother blowing the shofar. They must go hand in hand. And the Rebbe once explained that's because the Rambam and the Ravid disagree as to the core of why we say the verses that we say during the blessings. According to the Ravid, the verses themselves make God king. They make God employ his remembrance. They make the effect of the shofar. And so, if you don't have the blessings, the shofar is worth nothing. If you only have the blessings without the shofar, of course it's worth nothing. But according to the Rambam, no, the shofar stands alone. That's what coronates God as king. When the Jews do what they have to do, they coronate God as king. The verses that we say in the blessings are only a proof from the Torah to the fact that we just established. And so they aren't essential to one another. Says the Rambam, Shtei Ayaris. If you have two cities, in one of them you know for sure there is somebody who is fluent to make all the 9 blessings. But you know for sure there's no shofar. In the second city, you don't even know for sure. Maybe there's somebody who knows how to blow, maybe not. Go to the second one. Go to the shofar, even if it's only on the off chance. Because according to the Rambam, the obligation to blow shofar is biblical. The obligation to make blessings is rabbinic. So if you have a doubt, a possibility of fulfilling a biblical commandment, even if you have a certainty of fulfilling a rabbinic commandment, go for the possibility of the biblical over the rabbinical.